Donal Gallagher, thank you for taking the time to have a chat with me today. For some time, I've been doing a series of history podcasts. I started off looking at the various events of 1920. So it was generally on the history, but I sort of branched out a bit then, Donal, and I went to like Cork winning the double in 1990, and I branched out on all sorts of things, but I covered, because I saw this fabulous documentary that you featured in over Christmas about how the 70s changed Ireland. And really, you could call it, arguably, you could call it the birth of alternative culture in Ireland. And when rock music came to town, it was a great documentary. It talked about the Mountain Dew Festival in Macroom in 1978, which your brother, Rory Gallagher, headlined. You, his manager and brother, were instrumental in that as well. And when I was chatting about that, I said, you know what, I must get chatting to Donal Gallagher and get the story of, everybody in Cork knows Rory Gallagher. I mean, we've Rory Gallagher Plaza and we've statues, and, you know, we know he was Ireland's first rock icon, but perhaps there are many younger people of these days that don't maybe know the full richness of the story. And that is why I'm grateful for you joining me today. So where or how can we begin the story of Rory Gallagher?
Well, I think we're just bearing down on his 27th, sadly, his anniversary, which will be on June 14th. And I suppose it's a way of working backwards to the beginnings of Rory. In some ways, his legacy is stronger today than it ever was. As we speak, there was a record store release of Rory. It was a rare live appearance in San Diego, which was recorded and recently found, and that got just put out on vinyl for the One Day Record Store. So, and it's currently number 3 in the blues charts at Billboard in America. So, you know, it's just extraordinary how his appeal has grown.
His legacy lives on.
And it's almost like, in some ways, it skipped a couple of generations. I think there was, in a sense, before Rory left us, there was almost, people had become so knowledgeable about music themselves, you know, and might I add, through Rory's influence, that he almost got erased out of the situation and almost airbrushed out of popularity. And I think it then took a new generation who luckily had the likes of YouTube and other mediums to go back and revisit and sort of, I spoke to lots of them who can't get over the fact that Rory wasn't sort of more widely known, but that was Rory himself too. I mean, he basically he was anti-singles, so he never made what you would call a commercial release other than what he did in his albums. So there are kind of no milestones to go back and say, oh, well, you know, Tattooed Lady, Million Miles Away, all the favorites going to my hometown could have been, you know, chart successes potentially of their day, which probably would have been made it easier for people to have a stat on Rory, or the stat on the chart position, which unfortunately, particularly with radio, you just fall out of that whole circuit. But you know, I think the strength of his music is from a live context as well. So you have the likes of the various Rory tribute festivals all over the world, I might add, from Tokyo to Turkey to Athens, right through to the ones in Ireland and Ballyshannon and the likes, where his music is played live and repeated. So there's an upside to the whole thing. And then what's great, and Rory would love about that, is that it's such an influence on young musicians and players, and where they can go and test themselves out against the older boys who know it all, whatever. So that's what, you know, not that you want to turn them into a contest, but it does, you know, all the guitar slingers come into town, and there's always the young buck trying to make his name. So it also gives them a live gig to go to. And the interplay and swapping between the various countries, from I don't know, Finland, Norway, Holland, Belgium. They all have so they swap bands with the guys in Ballyshannon who swap with the guys in Belfast. And so it's actually created a Rory Gallagher circuit for a lot of bands. And there's a lot of musicians making a living, particularly, ex-musicians with Rory who sort of go with their tribute bands. I mean, they're playing in the States and they're playing here, there, and everywhere. They're making a living. So it is very much alive and kicking.
Well, you referenced Ballyshannon, so let's maybe take that as a starting point, because it's all, I've friends from Ballyshannon. It's Ballyshambles, as they endearingly refer to it, and Bundoran and out that way. It's a lovely part of South Donegal, and let me tell you what I know, and you can then jump in with that. So Ballyshannon claim Rory as one of their own as well, and they've some right to, as he was born up there. Your dad is a Cork man who was working on the electricity generating Lower Loch Earn. So the Lake Loch Earn flows down through Ballyshannon and out into the Atlantic, and they built a dam there to generate electricity. Your dad moved up from Cork to work on this project and spent a number of years there. Rory was born there, and that's Ballyshanon's claim on what is otherwise a Cork man.
Yeah, a correction on my father. My father was a Derry man.
Oh wow! Well, there you go. Because the Gallagher obviously is a name from up, but your mum's the Cork woman, so.
My mother is Cork as you can get,
through and through,
and adored Cork City, and so my dad had joined the Free State Army, as it was known, being a Derry man. Just before the outbreak of the war, in fact, he crossed over into Lifford from the Bogside and joined the Free State Army as a private. He ended up arriving in Cork as a lieutenant. He was commissioned. So plus he was a very talented musician. He had his own Ceilidh Dance Orchestra, the Inish own Ceilidh Dance Orchestra. So the gene that bypassed me, and well, it went to Rory first, so it never came down the line, was very much from my father. I mean, in fact, my father played the Cork Opera House as a concert for what was then the troops in Cork, stationed in Cork. So he played these various gigs with his piano accordion. And
along the way.
Yeah, so then they were all demobbed, and he married my mother in 47, but he got seconded by the army to be up on the border. Because
so I've the story arseways, really.
Yeah, in fact, he was one of the few men that actually knew the other side of the border and was able to draw maps, because of being a musician. He'd probably walked to Feshes or traveled to Feshes. He was also a boxer, so he knew every inch of the road in the North of Ireland. So I think he was whatever uses. The dam was being built 1 mile from the border. Also, it was a German contract at that time with Siemens. So it'd be interesting to look back at the controversy of it. But yes, it was Ballyshannon. So.
Well, if you wouldn't mind, let me just halt you there and ask you a few things that strike me about that. Do you know where was it Collins Barracks he was stationed in?
Yeah, he was stationed in Collins Barracks.
And do you know where he met your mum?
Well, in the city,
out and about.
The usual dances and various people introductions. So I think initially he met my aunt, who introduced him to her sister. So.
And did they marry in Cork ahead of going up?
Yeah.
And you're the older brother, are you?
No, younger.
You're the younger brother. So were you born up north as well?
Yeah, I was born in the Bogside.
Wow.
In Derry.
Jeez.
But I mean, my mother it wasn't pleasant for my mother when Rory was born, I might add. But anyway, so she said that after her experience in the hospital there, that the next birth would be a home birth. So I was about to arrive, and my mother got in a train and went to my grandmother's in Derry. So
wow, What a different world for your mum. I mean, even today, the north of Ireland, at Donegal, whatever part of the north, is so far away from Cork that, I mean, people, go up on holidays and stuff like that, but, people don't know it. So it was a whole new world for your mum to be up in Donegal and have in-laws then in Derry. And that was quite an experience for her.
And effectively, there were alien accents in those days,
yeah.
So, the Derry accent, certainly when I came down to Cork, I mean, it was, just the whole class in the North Monastery. As soon as I'd open my mouth, would completely collapse because, and I'd turn around and say, well, I find your accent just as funny.
So did you? Okay, so right. I am enjoying this because I always wondered about that what's the actual story about the Ballyshannon bit. So we've maybe jumped a little bit too far ahead into the Bogside. So he's up, is he in Finner Camp or something like that? And he's working as his role in the Irish Army, and he's stationed up there. So the ESB dam has nothing really to do with it other than that was at the same time, is it?
Well, he was technically employed by the ESB.
Right.
So I know the Finner Camp was there. I really don't know beyond that, because then when his work was done and my mother was in Derry and I was born, and wasn't actually expected to survive, but fortunately did. So the family then were sort of more centered in Derry for a period of time, and then work was very scarce. Once a project like a dam is finished, it's then my father moving back into Derry wasn't very welcome in some quarters because he was in the Irish Army, which was viewed with suspicion. Plus the fact that he'd been commissioned an officer meant that he could go back every year and do his 6 weeks training to be in there. So eventually the pressures of not being able to get work, the family made a couple of trips to the UK, to Coventry, Birmingham, and I have vague memories of how devastated they were after the war, but I didn't, when you're that young, you don't get it. But it was very tough on my mother. She couldn't cope with that and kept pleading with my father that, there was a better life in Cork. She really was heartbroken, missing Cork, missing her family, knew that there was a better life and, a better situation for us, the kids in Cork, because she also was quite a perceptive woman. And so, the potential of what was going to happen in the north of Ireland. And she was determined to get us
away from that,
down to Cork and settled in Cork. So that it happened in a few dribs and drabs, but it was a reconciliation in 1 minute, and then
I mean, listen, families do what they need to do, and I mean, I'm a new father of a 6-month-old, and it's a tough thing having a baby. So all of that moving around with a couple of kids is difficult. But so at what age do the family and does Rory and does yourself land back down in Cork? I appreciate there's the dribs and the drabs, but at what point do you become established? And I guess actually, knowing Cork as I do, that must have been difficult. You must have been like an alien landing from another planet coming down with a Derry accent.
Yeah, I mean, initially, my grandmother had a bar in McCurtain Street, and it was a big household, so there was a lot of other members of the family in there because, which was fantastic. So my mother's youngest sister, Noreen, was a young woman working in Dunlop's. My uncle Jimmy, who was still, he'd gone to university, he'd gone to America, got the money in the car plants to put himself through university, and he was in the household, and he was responsible for what's now the MIT or CIT. He was the founding principal of the RTC and CIT.
And what's your mother's family name?
Roach.
Roach. Oh, there you go. It's as Cork as you can get.
Yeah, and so it was a very dynamic, and it suddenly being the youngest in the household, and you have all these older people.
Yeah.
being really nice to you and, you know, friendly. So
it felt like home pretty quickly.
Oh, very much. And then with the customers in the bar, you just got to know everybody on the street. And, you know, McCurtain Street was a very dynamic street at that time.
Yeah.
You know, between the Thompson's bread factory was full going, they had all their cafes, and, you know, you had Scott's, you had all the cinemas, you had quite a few cinemas in the street. You had the Metropole Hotel, which was the sort of center of the international, and plus the fact the airport didn't exist at that time as an airport. So effectively everything came through the docks or through Cove. The liners, the Americans came into Cove, came up on the train to Cork. You know, the Innisfallen was in
the Innisfallen docking down the thing, the train coming in. So yeah, you were in the heart of it.
Oh, absolutely. It was a real, you know, dynamic international city. You know, I suppose the only difference would have been from the north of Ireland. It was from a music point of view. When we were in Derry, it was very formative for Rory, particularly because the port of Derry had been given over to the Americans in the Second World War. So that was their main naval base for Europe. And then it continued there because of the Cold War. So they were stationed, they had built the biggest antenna and were broadcasting American music, you know, whether you liked it or not. I mean, if you had a radio or anything that was reciprocal, I remember the station would just automatically come through. So, and that's where Rory kind of started initially listening to the Jazz Hour, which was really hard jazz back then. I mean, I remember actually getting frightened that Rory figured out how to surf the radio and find the stations and the music he was after, you know, and then you get this big bass voice saying, you know, this is the Jazz Hour, you know, you are listening to. And I think it sounded to me like the devil. I mean, it was like I'd run out of the room, but Rory stuck with it. And through those jazz programs, they would then introduce a little bit of blues. And then the BBC created the Chris Barber Jazz Hour once a week, and his banjo player was Lonnie Donegan, who went off then and got his own career. But Chris, bless him, who only died last year at 90, Chris would bring on people like Sonny Terry, Brownie McGee, and then he founded the clubs in London, like the Marquee, the 100 Club, with his manager, so he could invite the musicians in America. So he told me this, that he'd swap the visas for Louis Armstrong to come in. So if Louis Armstrong was so huge, so to come in, he would then get a reciprocal visa to go to America. And that's where he heard Muddy Waters in Chicago. And then he invited Muddy Waters to come over to the UK with the Rosetta Tarp and various other blues musicians. In fact, on YouTube, there's a couple of very good programs made at the time where they actually hired a train and they would stop at the stations and they'd play on the opposite platform because people weren't used to the music. And it was a way of introducing, you know, jazz and blues into the UK. So Chris was the godfather of all that. And so he was kind of a hero to Rory, but through that he heard Lonnie Donegan and of course the Rock Island Line, and Chris was the bass player on it, but that split Lonnie Donegan from the band because Lonnie's hit became bigger than the sum of the parts. So and oddly enough, Lonnie Donegan has a North Cork connection, so we became very close friends before, you know, over the years, but then particularly before he died. And I was encouraging him to move to Ireland from the circumstances he was in, and we did his genealogy, and he was descended from John Donegan from Ballydonegan, North Cork, who incidentally had married a Mary Gallagher. So it's funny how the circles go around.
Absolutely. So that sounds like the time spent in the north was very formative for Rory. Again, what age then did he and did you land down in Cork? And you know, and maybe how long did it take before you guys were like, we're Cork, or how did that work? Because, you know, he is such an icon for Cork,
Yeah,
but
well,
clearly the north is also very influential on him, or his time spent there.
Rory and I had just started school in Derry, and the incentive to get Rory was that my mother promised once we'd get to Cork, she had gotten him a little plastic ukulele, Elvis model, whatever it was, which at that time to a kid was a guitar, but Rory knew it wasn't. I mean, he'd learned some chords on it and knew that he had to have a bigger instrument. So that was the incentive for Rory to settle down into school in Cork. And sure enough, when we got to McCurtain Street, within a couple of weeks, Rory had got his wooden acoustic from Crowley's, which was then on Merchant's Quay. So that was it. Rory was, you know, an extra set. He was just.
Is he 7 or 8, Donal, or?
Yeah, he's 8, somewhere between 8 and 9. But yeah.
And then you're what, 4 or 5 or 6 or something?
Oh no, just a couple of years behind.
Oh yeah, okay.
So
are you the 2 boys? Is there more than you?
No, just the 2 of us.
2 boys. So thick as thieves, and off to the North Mon together. He's looking after you, is he?
Yes, yeah, very much. I mean, Rory could handle himself. Not that there was any. You were a curiosity more than anything else, and some of the boys were extremely kind, and you know, times were tough for everybody. So there was no kind of, you know, it's just that the language thing and understanding. Because I remember eventually we had a very decent teacher in a brother Pharisee who decided that the 5th class, which was confirmation in those days, you know, was done and dusted. Look, you know, the bishop is just going to smack you in the cheek and you're all confirmed. Like, don't worry too much about the number 461, whatever that is, in the catechism, which was all recited. And he decided that actually it would be much better to do a musical. So he got all the class together to do the Mikado for a Christmas situation. So, and he brought in a recording machine for the first time and was actually in an odd way doing elocution lessons with some of the lads. And some of the lads were, you know, were very rural, and their accents were very rural as well. So, I mean, it was the funniest thing to hear a Derry accent alongside a, you know, a West Cork accent or whatever, shaping up. But, you know, we all got on, and, you know, we had to learn how to play hurling and learn how to learn Gaelic. And my first experience, I remember, was being brought up in front of the class because they weren't sure where I'd fit in the streaming. And because I didn't have any Gaelic whatsoever. And I got asked by the head brother to, and he said it in Gaelic to me, which I couldn't understand, which was to recite the second part of the Shade of Ahawura, which is the Hail Mary. And I was just looking at him stupid. And he then turned around to the class and he said, "You see, boys, there's the problem in the north of Ireland. They suppress the language. You know, here's a perfect example, and we're going to teach this boy Gaelic." Yeah, so, you know, and I got put back in class on top of everything. So I felt very. Rory was much brighter than I was, and he excelled, in fact. And through the years, he'd always win. You either had a choice of the Holy Picture, or the ball, or the book. And so Rory would, you know, was getting first in this class, and then one year he suddenly wasn't first. I'm going, "Rory, my God, what, you know, what's changed? You know, like you're losing your." And he said, "No. He said, I just got fed up with getting the Holy Picture, because if you come first, you can't in front of the brothers ask for the football." You know, so there were tough and good times at the same time.
Yeah. So, like, I mean, that's very young to be as interested in music as he is. I mean, would you have seen American GIs walking around Derry? Might that have been, would the exoticism of that have been attractive? And then even listening to jazz if he's coming down to Cork at 8 looking for a guitar, he's already been listening to those shows.
Oh yeah, yeah. And we would have seen troops around Derry City. Yeah, I mean, they would all, from their base, and particularly on the weekends.
Looking cool.
Also, television was in its infancy.
Yeah.
And had started. So televisions were, sold in the city centre shops. So I remember particularly one store up in the Diamond had the television, but it would close at 6 o'clock and leave the television on till. But there were no verbals at all.
Yeah.
So, but Rory would actually make me go up, or we'd go up and stand outside, because the big television program at that time for music was the 6-5 special, which usually featured Lonnie Donegan and the skiffle, which was the sort of early blues of the day, or a version of the blues.
Well, it's certainly what influenced the likes of the Beatles, isn't it?
Oh yeah. So at 6:05, the shop would be closed, and all you could do. But Rory was so intense on the musicians that he knew all the lyrics. And so you'd have a little crowd gathered outside the shop, because everyone would watch it anyway. It was just hypnotic. And Rory would actually sing the lyrics of the songs. He'd lip sync with and entertain the crowd outside.
Wow. Because I always got the impression that he was kind of quite a shy guy. That sounds more maybe outgoing than. I mean, despite the fact that he was a performer out on stage, but as a person, I always got the impression or a sense that maybe he was quite a shy guy and sometimes a little uncomfortable being out in the public eye. So that sounds like he enjoyed performing.
Well, it's difficult to put Rory in. He was two people. He was a Jekyll and Hyde. Rory was born to perform. Put him on the stage, he was a different animal altogether. Take him off stage. So, in some ways, his life was just living to be on the stage. And then he was extrovert. Off stage, he was, he'd go back into this private shell that was very hard to kind of, even to late in life, he wouldn't even let the guy in to read a gas meter, or it's just so private about himself.
Wow.
And when he was performing, he just transcended into somebody else. Yeah.
So, I mean, your dad, you mentioned, is a musician and playing gigs in Cork when he was stationed here. Did he continue with the music? Was music all around you as a family? And was that a bit of the driving force behind Rory's interest in it?
Well, no, he didn't come to Cork. For whatever reason, he wasn't coming to Cork despite my mother's pleading. So whether it was he was a proud Derry man too, and he felt that he should be able to get a job in his own city, given his achievements, and plus support his own people. So he would, and plus his work in that time in Birmingham or Coventry or whatever in construction, and he was playing music at night to all the Irish communities. So he stayed on doing that. I think my mother, we as a family, grew up in the belief that he was going to turn up one day. He was going to come back to Cork, and then eventually, years and years later, he went back to Derry himself. So and we saw him a few times. So but it did. Sadly, that didn't work out, and but we were then very entrenched in Cork and happy out, put it that way. So,
yeah, look, there's loads of questions that you could. We don't have to follow that train of the story too much, but when Rory was at his, on stages around the world, had your dad any contact with him then, or was he a part of that at all, or?
I suppose he wasn't really a part of it, because also communications were purely letter writing.
Yes.
There was no, yeah, there were phones. I mean, I remember there was one phone box on Curtin Street, which was shared by the whole community. And you'd have to book a call. Or if you were lucky enough to know one of the receptionists in the Metropole, they'd put a call through for you or take a call. So
if you weren't physically there, it was hard to stay in touch.
Yeah, I mean, compared to the current world that we have, everything from a WhatsApp to email to, it's instant. There was a void back then, and life probably was at a slower pace because of that. But no, there was the odd letter, and then a response mightn't come for weeks because my father would have changed address or done something like that. So but he was conscious of Rory's success, particularly coming into the 70s and that. So
well, let's go to there. So I mean, I know Rory was born in 48, so maybe it's the mid 50s that you're down in Cork and you're young lads. So we bring it into the 60s, and as I saw in that documentary of how rock changed, or was it how the 70s changed Ireland? It was something along those lines, and show bands were the thing through, I suppose. I mean, even rock and roll, really, like when did rock and roll begin for you? I mean, that's sort of Elvis in mid 50s, and he's playing black music to a white audience, and then you move into the 60s, and so where does it all fit with you guys there with that?
Well, as we were leaving Derry, Elvis had come on the scene. The big guy in rock and roll was Bill Haley. He was the superstar from a European perspective too, but Lonnie Donegan had risen. So, and in fact, Elvis came through with such a blinding force that there was almost like a slight resentment about this new kid on the block because, hey, Lonnie Donegan is the hero here, Bill Haley's the hero, and Elvis just completely transformed the whole rock scene. So we arrived down in Cork with the knowledge of that music. I mean, you would only RTE one radio station. That was it. I mean, you were lucky if a sponsored program would play, something akin to music. So effectively, the show bands became the replica bands for rock and roll. I mean, and they were very good musicians. I mean, I know that it takes a lot of stick nowadays, and that's easy to do. But to be of that time and to bring rock and roll or music, or they did 5-hour sets, in the middle of nowhere in the country at a crossroads dance hall. It was the only
entertainment
of entertainment. So they grafted very hard. So Rory had progressed from doing little concerts around the city. I would join him because he wasn't allowed to sing a rock and roll song as such, particularly, I don't know, on a Sunday night we'd be doing a charity concert up in St. Augustine's Hall, and certainly if it went near the monastery, there was no chance you could do anything rock and roll. So Rory would resort to Roy Rogers' Four-Legged Friend. You could sing about bestiality, but you couldn't sing about Living Doll, because I remember one night Rory was in the Northern Monastery in the Mikado, the whole machinery broke down, and Rory had done just a couple of innocent numbers, and got told by the brother, go back on and save the show. And Rory said, well, I've done all my songs. And the guy said, I don't care what you sing what you like. You have to save the show. You go. And he went out and did, I think, Cliff Richard's Living Doll. I mean, the other lads in the school were thrilled to bits. They were up on their feet. The following day, not only did Rory get expelled from the monastery, I got expelled as well, and that had nothing to do with it. But such was the view was taken, and also the guitar was looked as an instrument of the devil.
I'm sorry, my jaw's a bit on the floor with that, Donal. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Expelled.
Yeah. And then eventually
you excited people too much.
Yeah, it was just before Christmas. Mikado happened, and then we were told we were expelled, and then 2 weeks Christmas holidays, we were told that you could have another chance. You were, you know. So Rory was kind of very concerned about what he could play or couldn't play.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we talk about countries in the Middle East and the clerics. It was very much that kind of scene. The church and state,
the orthodoxy, and well, do you know, Donal, it's interesting, and just very briefly, sometimes when people cast shade on other parts of the world and how it is, and I say it's not that long ago that many of those things were exactly like that here. So it's easy to throw stones, but you forget that we might have come from such situations of control and suppression and oppression. And
yeah. So out of that, I got press ganged into going on stage with Rory, because he'd do his four-legged friend and his Grand Coulee Dam, inanimate objects, whatever, were fine. But the one piece of rock and roll you could get away with was the Everly Brothers. And Rory and I at home used to practice the Everly Brothers and the harmonies. And, you know, we like all brothers, there's a natural musical thing there. So he'd do his 3 or 4 numbers, and then I'd be invited up to sing, you know, Wake Up Little Susie, or I mean, the sort of innocent songs, or Ebony Eyes, and you know, but they were the songs you could get away with as rock and roll. And then one night it went on so well, it went in to another encore, and Rory said, nothing else, do your party piece. And I used to do a Scottish Soldier, which was a #1 hit by Andy Stewart, because I had a Northern Ireland accent. I could do the Scottish accent. So I said to Rory, I don't want to do it. And come on, you got to be professional, get on and do it, you know. And so I started off with, there was a soldier, a Scottish soldier who wandered far away. And Rory joined in with the guitar, and I stopped in the middle of it and I said, excuse me, Rory, there's no guitar in this song. And so I got fired. That was it.
You're out of the band.
Never on stage again. You know, sort of Liam and Noel before it ever was invented. And
although you ended up the manager, so.
Well, to get back in his good books, I used to carry his guitar and amps and truck whatever across the town just to get back in with him. I didn't particularly like being on stage, to be honest. Because I was always the spare wheel. I'd always I remember ending up in Macroom and being put in with the girls' team because they were short one for a quiz, you know, and then you were asked questions, you know, in Gaelic that you still hadn't mastered, you know. So it was always, being that bit younger, it was always an hour more past your bedtime. So you were always, you know, getting up for school. But it was a great experience. So that, you know, but Rory progressed out of that, found an ad in the paper for, he was trying to form a group around Cork and couldn't find anybody, you know, he found one person but with similar tastes, or, you know, I mean, he had a good friend, Johnny Campbell, great musician, that they were trying to get the thing. So Rory sort of went and joined the show band looking for a guitarist singer, and telling them that at the time he was 17, when he was 15. So he got the job, and then he had to join the federation so he could play the show band role. So he managed to do that by doing an instrumental on the guitar, and so he was off gigging at night then. And
that's right. I think I recall maybe Roz, when I was chatting about the Mountain Dew. There was something like you had to, in order to be allowed play live, you had to pass a test by the gatekeepers, by the union or something, was it? Or because you were potentially because if you played too many instruments, you were taking jobs off other bands. There was something like that, is it?
Yeah, no, that was a little later, when Rory then had left the show band and he had formed Taste, which was a 3-piece band.
Yeah.
they wouldn't accept a three-piece band, or the union said
Too
you
few
have
musicians.
To be minimum of 6 to be in a show band hall. So I'd get so taste had by then started, and Philip Prendergast and Peter Prendergast, Peter ran the Arcadia. Philip was Rory's manager. He was the younger brother of Peter, so he had managed Rory's show band and had kind of with Rory transformed it from being a show band into a beat band or more of a rock band. It was, and then it went from the Fontana to the Impact. It was more direct, and instead of wearing show band suits, they were wearing polo necks, which were very fashionable because of the Beatles at the time, and they were, they had Beatle cuts and their hair was getting longer, and they were sort of getting away with it, if you like, in the show, and that was becoming much more popular. But then they went off to the UK and they got gigs in Europe. Rory was desperate to get, not just stay in Ireland, but get out there internationally. And I mean, there's a great picture of Rory getting onto an Aer Lingus plane at the age of 17, the day after he had done his leaving cert exam, and they're going off to an airbase just outside Madrid called Alcalá de Henares.
Alcalá de Henares, yeah.
Yeah. And that was the big US airbase. And Rory was desperate to get in front of an American audience to see if they would accept his band and his music, or and they had a great time, mind you. And of course, it was a terrific bit of publicity at the time to, welcome the Impact home from abroad. And
yeah, the conquering heroes.
Yeah.
Let me ask you just a couple of things, maybe just to fill in a little bit, because I like where we're at now. We're kind of at the dawn of it all, really. But it seems a silly question because I'm guessing the answer is yes. But in having the ukulele and getting his first guitar from Crowley's, was he pretty good straight away, sort of thing? Like, was he sort of a natural? I mean, I know that seems silly. Was Rory Gallagher a natural guitarist? Like, he's like literally the most natural guitarist the world has known. But was it apparent straight away?
Oh yeah, I mean, the day Rory got that wooden acoustic guitar, and he got a stack of guitar chords. He was desperate to teach me. He was trying to. In fact, he would love if I could be a rhythm guitarist for him, and that's what he kind of, a bit of a. And he did everything, and of course, I just get A, B, A, C, D, and the basics, and that. And he was already on volume 10 of jazz chords. He'd go down to Pickett's in Patrick Street, and they had a piano shop, and he'd have figured out the chords and got information. So he was progressing at a rate of knots, which was extraordinary. Then, of course, he had to join the show band. He had to have an electric guitar, so he got a Burns a Selmer Solid 7, I remember, and which was about £12.50 on the Never Never HP. And of course, my mother then freaked. Oh, you can't play the guitar without an amplifier. You have to buy the amplifier as well, and that's another £12.50. So you're into debt. But she was very good about it anyway. He got that, and then it wasn't long before he was saying, this Selmer guitar isn't good enough. I have to get a professional. Like it looked the part, but So then suddenly one day, this spacecraft landed in Crowley's guitar store, and it was a Fender Stratocaster, just like Buddy Holly's. And I remember Rory coming up and almost in a state of shock and saying, "You cannot believe what I've seen. The guitar that the shadows up at Buddy Holly, it's the Buddy Holly color. That was it. I went down and we stood. The store was closed that evening, but we stood outside in awe of this contoured, amazing shaped guitar. And the following day, I think it was the following day, I think I skipped off school on Rory's behalf. He wrote me a note probably because Rory had very good handwriting. And to go down, and then Rory was in talking to Michael Crowley, and the next thing, Michael Crowley's taking the guitar out of the shop window, and it had a price tag of £100 on it, which was, you know, you write 100,000, it mentally would have been the same number in today's world. And Rory, in his own persuasive way, telling Michael that he needed to upgrade the guitar. And then Michael would be, it was a very, very kind man. I mean, he was an absolute gent of a man. And, you know, he'd make a good program. He said, well, how many gigs are you going to get, Rory? And Rory said, well, potentially we're going to go out and tour backing Rory Gallagher, who was the #1 singer in Ireland at that time. And, you know, we're going to get 3 weeks work. And next thing, there was all sorts of sums done. And Rory had managed to take the Never Never pay system, whatever was the hire purchase agreement, and extend it by 36 months from the year it was, which, you know, and work out that the payment plan or whatever. So this would be then presented to my mother as and Michael then just said, well, why don't you take the guitar home with you and try it out first before you make such a huge commitment? And so it was kind of smuggled into the house, and Rory decided to hide it under my bed so it wouldn't be found or whatever. And then plus the fact when you're in a public house that's being terrified and going to school that the guitar might get stolen the day, somebody might creep up the stairs and all that. So it was a very nerve-wracking experience. And then my mother, I think, met Michael Crowley, and it kind of, he said to my mother, how's Rory getting on with the guitar? So the game was up.
What guitar?
Yeah, and she was distraught. I mean, because financially, you know, the money wasn't there. I mean, she adored Rory, and she was doing everything she could for him. But this was just such a. And I remember Rory coolly kind of saying to her, "Look, if I get this guitar, not only will I be able to play lead guitar, I'll be able to play rhythm at the same time. This kind of guitar. So therefore, the band won't need a second guitarist. I'll make it pay. I will work, and I'll save all my pocket money and do jobs," which he did. I remember he had an old tobacco tin, and he put it 2 and 6, or some kind relative might give a couple of shillings or whatever, because that's you know, you saved in coins in those days. You were, you know, a paper note was, and he would meet all the payments, and my mother relented, and then of course he progressed from the Showbands into then wanting to have a 3-piece band, which then the show band had gone off to Europe and been in London. The other guys were getting disenchanted with trying to make a living, particularly during Lent in Ireland. All the dance halls got closed by the church. There was no dancing, and so therefore there was no work for musicians. So they would have to take the boat to the UK and play at the ballrooms of North London and Coventry or wherever the Irish won. But, you know, again, every show band in Ireland was doing that for 6 weeks leading up to Easter. Because they had to be a professional show band. They couldn't be seen walking around, nor could they be seen second jobbing. And so Rory was all for it. Rory kind of endured the starving, but he would spend his nights just going down to the Marquee, Wardour Street, sing any musicians that he could. You know, he adored people like Georgie Fame. He'd go along and see Long John Baldry's Steam Packet, who had Elton John on piano, and Rod Stewart was the other singer in the band. You know, bands like the Peddlers, who was a jazz trio. who actually influenced Rory into that a three-piece could work. That he was convinced that after seeing them that he could do it, and so they went. The band sort of Showbands split up in London. Rory took the bass player and the remnants, so there was Johnny Campbell and Oliver Tobin, and they carried on in the van, got to the gig in Hamburg or Kiel or wherever it was, convinced the promoter that the band, the show band, would be arriving in a few days, but they had got flu back in London. And but rather than let them down, Rory said, look, we came to perform as a three-piece, you know, until the others arrive. And so after 2 weeks of this, the promoter just said, they're never going to come out, you know, and booked them. So he had cracked it as a three-piece. Then that version, which was still the Impact of sorts, so arrived back in Cork and then disintegrated. Meantime, there was a very popular Cork band, the Axels, who were effectively Cork's answer to the Beatles. You know, there was always they were very much a Beatlesque band, and they were trying to recruit Rory in. So Rory sort of turned the tables a little bit and recruited them into a new band called Taste.
Donal, I'm going to stop you and make a suggestion, because I've loved this. I've loved, like, it's like a sociological story, and it's a sense of Cork and Derry and Ireland at a different time, and a whole sort of description of developments in music and in culture and in society as well. But like, it feels like we're at the beginning of Rory's story as a musician, and as, you know, moving into becoming the rock icon that he became. But it's been such a dense story that we probably have this much time to go again in it. What I might suggest to you is, if you would be good enough at some point in the future, might we come back to this chat and leave this as sort of a bit of a part one, and delve back into it? Because I don't know, I hope you've enjoyed it.
That's great.
Magic. Donal Gallagher, thank you so much. Pleasure.